Welcome to the Bluecoat. My name is Bryan Biggs, the artistic director here, and tonight is a collaboration with Liverpool John Moores University, the latest in its Luminary lecture series arranged with the Liverpool School of Art and Design. Relocating the Remains, History and Representation is the title of this evening's discussion that brings together a curator and a writer and two artists that Bluecoat has worked with for a very long time. I have to apologise that Kader Attia is not able to join us this evening, so I'm sorry if you've come here specifically to hear him, because he's got food poisoning and he wasn't able to be here. So despite that, I think we're going to have a great conversation with the other three. So the event is in advance of the publication by Bloomsbury next year of a book called The Sphinx Contemplating Napoleon, Global Perspectives on Contemporary Art and Difference, which is an anthology of essays and other writings by Gilane Tawadros. Tonight is the first in a series of talks. I think it's the first, is it? Yes. A series of talks which will take place in different arts venues addressing some of the book's themes. Now, for those of you who don't know Gilane, she's had a long career in the visual arts, having curated many exhibitions and written extensively on contemporary art. The forthcoming book collects over 30 pieces of writing from over 2 decades, from journals to exhibition catalogues, that interrogate some of the shifts in contemporary art in an age impacted by globalisation. Gilane is currently Chief Executive of DACS, D-A-C-S, an organisation that campaigns for artists' rights. She serves on the board of European Visual Arts and is on the Intellectual Property Office's Copyright Advisory Panel. And she's also a trustee and vice chair of the Stuart Hall Foundation. Now, I'm sure some of you will remember The Unfinished Conversation, which is a film about cultural theorist Stuart Hall that John Aconfra premiered here as part of the Liverpool Biennial in 2012. Hall's library is housed at the Institute of International Visual Arts, INIVA, in London, of which Gilane was the founding director, establishing it as a groundbreaking agency at the leading edge of cultural debates nationally and internationally. Its brief was to promote the work of artists from diverse backgrounds and establish a framework for dialogue and exchange across the world, a new internationalism that challenged Western dominance in art and was a reflection of the cultural shifts taking place in our geopolitical environment at the close of the 20th century as we went into the new millennium. Now, Bluecoat, as some of you will know, has collaborated with INIVA on several occasions, including the 2003 exhibition titled Veil, that examined one of the most powerful symbols in contemporary culture, the veil. It was a prescient show, given the way that this symbol has since become even more highly charged, misinterpreted and exploited for political ends, not least by our current Prime Minister. We had, however, first worked with Gilane a decade earlier when she was commissioned to write an essay for a publication that followed the 1992 exhibition Trophies of Empire, a collaboration with venues in Liverpool, Bristol and Hull that explored colonial legacies and their imprint in the 3 port cities. That essay, called Sweet Oblivion, is included in Gilane's forthcoming anthology, and one of the artists in that exhibition, Keith Piper, who came up with the initial idea for Trophies, is on the panel this evening. I'm going to introduce the speakers in a minute. And I want to just quote from Sweet Oblivion, where Gilane writes very eloquently about place and memory. She says, "We wander through our city centres, weaving a path through the A to Z of street names and the tourist trail of ceremonial buildings and statues whose significance we as city dwellers have long forgotten. The day has already come when we recognise places and monuments by their inscriptions, but no longer recall their original function. The source of street names like Black Boy Hill and White Ladies Road in the heart of Bristol has become obscured by the clinical banality of a street index. Placed in alphabetical order, assigned a page and a grid reference, and consigned to the back page of a city map, these semantic traces of the city's past are now no more than geographical markers, evacuated of historical meaning. A white blanket of forgetfulness, as one writer elegantly put it, has been drawn across the material remains of slavery and empire in Britain's once glorious cities like Bristol and Liverpool. Just like the granules of sugar dissolving without trace in a sea of tea leaves, the legacy of Britain's imperial history has all but disappeared from popular consciousness. We would rather succumb to the law of sweet oblivion than linger over bitter remembrance of things past and now forgotten. So the relationship that Gilane discusses in this extract between history and memory, and indeed amnesia, and how it's explored through the prism of contemporary art, is the focus of one of Gilane's forthcoming chapters, and is what we'll be discussing this evening. What impact does the past and nostalgia for it have on the present? How can different histories inform and transform our understanding of the present? How might we think about cultural identity and representation in relation to these processes? More so than academic discourse or art criticism, it is artistic practice that provides Gilane with what she describes as the critical tools and intellectual framework for writing about art. So it's appropriate that she's invited artists to discuss some of the book's themes this evening. Contemporary art, she says, resists language, and I think this is one of the things we'd like to talk about. So the format for this evening is that I'm going to invite the three speakers to come to join us in a minute and there. And we're going to start a discussion, but we want to open it out to you a bit later on. So just to note, we are live streaming this, actually. So if anybody doesn't want to be live streamed, don't ask a question. But anyway, so I think what I'll do is actually introduce the two other speakers now, because we need to move on with the discussion. Keith Piper, I'm sure, needs no introduction to many of you. He lives and works in London and is Associate Professor of Fine Art and Digital Media at Middlesex University. His first exhibition at Bluecoat was in 1985, and then he showed in New Contemporaries the following year. He initiated the Trophies of Empire project, presenting his own work at the Merseyside Maritime Museum. He exhibited in several of FACT Video Positive festivals when the organisation was based here at Bluecoat. And he returned here with Unearthing the Banker's Bones, and that's an image from it there, in 2016, a co-commission with Innova for the Arts Council collection. He has exhibited widely in the UK and internationally, and a new solo show at Wolverhampton Art Gallery charts his pioneering practice over 3 decades. I went to the opening a couple of weeks ago. It's a fantastic show. Taking in painting, printmaking, installation, video, and digital and interactive technologies, his work explores colonial histories and issues of race and identity through a multimedia cut-and-paste approach. This evening's event takes its title from Keith's 1997 exhibition and publication by Innova, Relocating the Remains. Jo Stockham is Professor and Head of Printmaking at the Royal College of Art, London. Like Keith, she has a long relationship with Bluecoat as both curator and artist. With an extensive exhibition history, she first showed here in 1990 in a show called New Sculpture, and then in 1997 with Daryl Viner in an exhibition called Working in the Dark. In 2014, she curated The Negligent Eye, a group exhibition looking at the idea of the scan and the impact of digital technologies on printmaking practice. And for our tercentenary exhibition in the Peaceful Dome in 2017, she revisited and recontextualised earlier work themed around war and nuclear proliferation, gender and global capital. Her practice is installation-based and interdisciplinary, often dealing with histories of place, using a range of media, sculpture, print, sound, found materials and archives. Her recent show at Matt's Gallery London presented work using 3D print, a reflection of her fascination with definitions of the virtual and the real, and her interest in time, history, and in particular, the way in which technology creates and the means and metaphors with which we communicate. So I'm going to invite the speakers to come up to the join us in a minute. But before I do that, just to say that on your way out, we're going to give you a little card to fill in with your email, or to give us get your email addresses. We're doing a thing called impact study with the Arts Council to get your evaluation of whether you thought it was any good tonight. So do fill it in, and we'll contact you. The more evidence we can get that people actually come and enjoy these events, it helps our case with the Arts Council. So that's on your way out. So I think that's it. Can I invite Gilane, Keith, and Jo to come and join us? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Are we all sitting comfortably?
Not necessarily comfortably, but...
Oh, good grief.
There's this incredibly bright lights here.
I know
which
you.
is fine, I suppose, because that means that you can see us. But we can't see you. Which is
You will later. History. I think when we start with the question of history, it's something that the two artists use in their practice. And I'm going to ask in a minute if they could just talk about that focus and what impact, does the past and nostalgia for it have on the present in the work they make. And can different histories inform and transform our understanding of the present? But perhaps before I do that, perhaps, Gilane, a reflection on the importance of history. I mean, this is what your book is, in a sense, about artists engaging with history or histories.
Thank you, Bryan, and thank you for your beautiful introduction, and thanks to you, Louis, and the Bluecoat, Jajit and Caroline at St John Moores University for hosting us today. Trophies of Empire was a really groundbreaking exhibition that Keith conceived and co-curated with you, Bryan. And for those of you who don't know about it, it was time to coincide with the 500-year anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. So it was all around centenaries. But the connecting thread, but there's a connecting thread that this exhibition and the works in the exhibition explored, which was how reverberating events and traumas sort of cascade through 5 centuries into the present, and how their traces can be observed and seen and experienced in the present, in that present, 1992. But I think the critical importance of history is really not so much about history in itself, but about the process of remembering and forgetting, which is what I was trying to articulate in that essay. That it's not just about centenaries and anniversaries, and the media love centenaries and anniversaries as a way to reenact something or revisit something. But there's a question for me about what that reenaction entails. What more do we get from that process of a recovery and reenaction? And I think it's important to think about history, which is not just events beyond our living memory, and to bring it, to bear on the current political moment, because, our deeply divided country is right now drawing up really hardened fault lines, battle lines, actually, around what is remembered and what is forgotten, and different versions of the past which are kind of rubbing up against each other, radically different stories that we're telling ourselves about how we got here and what we should do next. And I think that in an era of, on the one hand, fake news, and on the other hand, society which is profoundly segmented and segregated around social and economic lines, we really have to find a way to navigate these competing narratives. There's a wonderful book that's just been published that I commend to you all by the journalist and writer Jack Schenker, called Do We Now Have Your Attention? And in the 2nd chapter, I think, of the book, he goes to Tilbury, which is one of the highest voting Brexit places in the UK. And he talks to people there, and they talk about the news coverage of Tilbury and how contemptuous much of the media is about the people who live there, about their lives, around what's the state of the place, as it were. And he says, that people are also contemptuous about what they see as that community's nostalgia for something that's no longer theirs, some past that perhaps never existed. And he sort of digs beneath the surface and has conversations with people where they take him to railway stations where they used to work that have closed down, that no longer exist, where everything has been sold off and nothing remains, to streets where pubs that had been there for 300 years and had been the fulcrum of a Dockland community no longer functions. So I guess what I'm saying is that we need a space apart, whether both intellectual and artistic, which is removed from the kind of political maelstrom in which we can reflect critically and go beneath the surface. And as Bryan said, I believe passionately that artistic practice and the very process of looking at art and thinking about art provides those tools. So it's not about facts and figures, it's not about competing accounts, literal accounts, but it's about a critical engagement with the past and representation, which is trying to reconnect the past with the present, but not in a literal way. And I think that's something that brilliant artists that are sitting alongside me here, Jo Stockham and Keith Piper, do extraordinarily well through their work.
Keith, perhaps you could talk about trophies, as we were talking about that, as something that was very much about something, a process that had started 500 years earlier. And yet I'm getting a lot of feedback now from the event we did in Bristol a few weeks ago that people say it's really up to the minute now.
Which was a fascinating event, I do have to say.
Yeah.
In Bristol. I mean, this whole gathering and this conversation is for me fascinating. It was fascinating to kind of gain an insight into your thinking around the book. And it's fascinating for me in particular because it is evoking the kind of recollection, not just of the Trophies of Empire as a project, but also because of its name, Relocating the Remains, which I'm really happy to kind of see that title back out and used once again. Because just see, and I came across it, and it was a pleasant surprise to kind of come across it on art and Facebook as the name of this event. So, oh yes, I recognise that name. Because it evoked a very, very particular body of work. And as Bryan says, I've just opened the show at Wolverhampton, which is like a sort of survey retrospective show. And so it has work from the 1980s, it has work from like 1992, and it has work from the 2000s. But the thing which somehow I completely forgot about was Relocating the Remains as a project in 1997. I'm kind of intrigued as to why that atom wasn't it embedded into the kind of nature of that project. However, in terms of this particular conversation about how we look at history, I think the Relocating the Remains project is really interesting because the project started from the notion of the historical fragment. It started with the notion of things which had been like lost and scattered and were just mere shadows, were fragments, were things which had disappeared into history. And the story behind that is that it was about in the mid-1990s that you first suggested this idea of a retrospective. A very nice. That was when Gilane was the director of INIVA. Approached me for this idea of a retrospective exhibition of the work that I had made in the 1980s and early 1990s. And now, unfortunately, a lot of that work had disappeared. It had been lost. It had been left in various storage rooms. It had been destroyed. Some of the other work was like large installations, so you couldn't really refrag. You couldn't bring those works back together again. They were works which actually dealt with history, with themes of history, of colonialism, of imperialism, etc., etc. But they all existed as fragments. The idea of relocating those remains is to kind of take those remains and to kind of place them back into an order, into something which we could then begin to kind of re-encounter as a version of history. And so that act of kind of relocation, becomes quite important for this, because it talks about the way that we encounter the historical fragment or the archival object or whatever, and then begin to kind of rescope a kind of narrative around those things to describe that historical thing in our time. What makes the Relocating the Remains project, and I won't go into this in any great depth, but what makes it especially interesting in terms of that idea of the history of a particular history being brought together in a particular moment, is that at that moment in the mid-90s, we were quite excited by the prospect of new technology, of interactivity, of this way of taking these fragments and digitizing them and bringing them into these kind of new media forms. And we did that. And I thought that was actually quite an interesting thing. What we didn't actually realize at the time, because I remember us being really optimistic about this thing as this new futurism, these great new tools. However, what we didn't understand at that moment is how rapidly those tools would become archaic. That those tools, in and of themselves, the stuff which we made in 1997, by 1999, people were coming to me. No, because we published a monograph, and in the back of the monograph was an interactive CD-ROM. It was built as, and we loved, it was myself and Gary Stewart who had put this thing together, and it was, all this kind of cutting edge, all this kind of stuff. 2 years later, somebody came up to me in an event like this and actually wanted to fight me because they had taken this CD-ROM out of its thing and put it in their computer, and the computer had broken. Because the computer said, "What is this old thing? I'm not using it," and the computer had frozen. Because the language system, the container in itself, had become archaic that quickly. And obviously, we also understand it's to do with Apple, and that was the moment just before Steve Jobs' return, and he was, even by technology standards, unusually ruthless in kind of cutting off old technologies. And so therefore, the things that we made in the 1990s, as containers for history, themselves became archaic really, really quickly. And so now we are confronted with this whole idea that we're not just attempting to relocate histories, but the actual container, the language, the thing which holds that history is in itself, absolutely fixed in a historical moment. And I think that's actually quite fascinating. Fascinating to be underneath this image as well. Because this image from the Banker's Bones, I was looking at this image and thinking, hold on, but that is this trickster character, who is a sort of, the trickster, the liar, the whatever, the person who constructs history, looking at the Banker's Ledger. The Banker's Ledger is itself being a book of lies. So in a sense, this image also brings home the kind of fragility of knowledge, the fact that it's contingent, and it's also contingent on the storyteller, which I think is quite interesting. I think that's quite key for our conversation here.
Absolutely. Jo, do you want to come in?
Yeah, and I think that's really, there's sort of two strands that I'm thinking of parallel. That one is to do with the changing nature of the archive given new technologies, something we were talking about on the way here, and the nature of history itself being structured by the internet and by the kind of notional fantasy of availability of everything, when we know that that's completely not true, and that the algorithm shapes the stacking of histories. And also what Gilane brought up about the nature of work. I'm very interested. My first ever commission and piece of work after college was for Stoke-on-Trent City Museum and Art Gallery, and I made work about the ceramics industry there. I'm very interested in work, the nature of work and the nature of industrial history in relation to the fantasies of empire and because it was based on manufacturing primarily. So that sort of sense in which the histories of the objects that surround us, the histories of artifacts, are completely embedded in the histories of colonialism and of class difference, of work, is something that I think there are ways of uncovering. And as an artist who makes things and who uses the labour of other people in all sorts of ways and uses the materials that are extracted from the earth by others in all sorts of places, I think our interrelatedness to the people that, to each other actually, the complexities of our interrelationships and the way in which any artifact that we use on an everyday basis, but also the archives of our museums and institutions, are embroiled in these really complex relationships between material practices and historical records. And those intersections and the complexities of those, I think, are very rich territories to assert a much more to assert our interdependence. And given the political rhetoric at the moment is about creating differences all the time, I think, and I just did a show for the European Union Gallery in London, which may close in the next few weeks, precisely because I felt it was really important to argue for different notions of Europe than are currently in the kind of public space. So it seems to me that complexity in history and histories and their intersections is what brings us all together.
Gilane, you wanted to come?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that's really important and connects Keith and Jo's work, and as part of this this particular nature of artistic practice and how it deals with history and the past, is, I'm picking up on, Keith, what you said about the historical fragment and how you then reconstruct or use that fragment, knowing that actually it can never be complete, it can never be completely recuperated, but you then, and the very word relocating is a signal, and the relocated remains signals the very impossibility of the fact of reconstructing something that's going to be complete or can be reconstituted, that it's always going to be fragmented and partial and incomplete. And that in itself is a really, really important thing. And then, Jo, your interest in objects and remnants, material traces, is, I think, incredibly important. The essay Sweet Oblivion was inspired by, a large extent, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's book 100 Years of Solitude, and where there's this community, there's a passage where people are forgetting what their everyday objects that surround them are for. So they start labeling them, they start putting names on, this is a knife, this is a spoon, this is a bowl. And then they start forgetting what a spoon is for. So they have to elaborate the labels. So this is a spoon, which is for doing this, and this is what a spoon is used for. So you can see where this is going. There's a trajectory where, in a sense, your existence becomes dependent on how you can actually remember those objects around you and what their function and purpose is, to the extent that you stop actually living because you are focusing so much on the process of remembering, you're not actually in the moment of now.
I'm still thinking that. That's fascinating, but I'll continue. Yeah.
Okay.
Could I just shift the conversation slightly in terms of something you describe in your introduction, Gilane, as double consciousness, in your case, post-independence Egypt and post-war Britain, as being your consciousness, if you like. And I wanted to ask the artists if they share that notion of, I think you call it a bifurcated vision, in drawing on their own histories, to actually challenge this idea of a dominant narrative. And perhaps you could say, I mean, obviously, Keith, in your case, it came through very strongly in the trophies piece. These, your particular identification with the process of the slave trade, etc.
Oh yes, of course, yeah, because and that actually goes back to a longer term interest in collage as a creative device, which goes back to my work, as a teenager, when just basically that thing of kind of bringing together a range of fragments, images, sounds, or whatever from a range of places, and by their coming together, you create a different meaning, a range of meanings, a range of new articulations, and that was very much a part of the work in trophies, the trade winds piece, which came out of my interest in collage, but in collage as articulated through a use of an even more archaic digital technology, which was used in the Amiga computer, which gives these really pixelated images, but allows you to kind of sample and bring lots of information together and articulate it through time. So in a sense, that was how the work was built, but the work was an attempt to revisit the memory of the slave trade and the centrality of the slave trade to the development of Liverpool. And it was housed in a building which was the Maritime.
It was the Maritime Museum, but it was before they had hardly anything, in fact, probably nothing, to acknowledge the role of slavery. Yeah. So this was a museum that was in terms of amnesia, absolute prime example of it. Yeah. And I've said this in Bristol with the session we had there. I think Keith's work being shown in that empty space there, almost like prompted that. I think they were doing it anyway. I think they had it. They were planning it. And I think 4 years later, the first version of what became the International Slavery Museum did open. Absolutely. But I think it was so powerful that your work was on that floor in this. It was almost like waiting to be colonised.
Yeah. It was a haunted space
with that narrative.
It was a space which had that kind of that memory. But I think that was the case with a lot of the work in the trophies, in the wider trophies project, because we had selected how many artists?
15.
15 artists to work in different sites in Liverpool and in Bristol and in Hull. And in all those cases, there was this kind of bringing back into the space of the present these narratives, these stories, these fragments, these objects, to kind of which then brought home these longer histories. And so clearly, within that, there is so much.
That's right. I think Nina Edge is here tonight, but Nina did a very powerful piece in Wilberforce House, which was the house that Wilberforce had lived in, and he was credited with being the architect of abolition. We know that's not strictly true, but he was the abolitionist MP, and it just resonated. And the same with Jaginda Lamba did a beautiful piece of sculpture in the garden here and in the garden at Wilberforce House. And it's just, I think, context and place is really, really important. Really important. I mean, Jo, do you want to talk perhaps about something? You've done quite a bit of site-specific work as well. Yeah,
in fact, the piece of work that I showed here with the canon that I then remade here for you was made for an exhibition in 3D 89 it was called. So it was made in 1989 for, or slightly before that, for a house that was built in Pitshanger Manor in West London. And I was really interested in the fact that the architect of the house had also built barracks for the redcoat soldiers in the Caribbean. So he was simultaneously with the house. There was a war going on, and there was British soldiers in the Caribbean fighting and implanting themselves and in the plantations. And so there was this double consciousness in the house, and I made work which brought the displays of dress and furniture in close collision with the violence that was funding the building of the house in the first place. And so that, for me, was a very explicit piece of work that was bringing together bodies and furniture and drapery and fashion with the violence that was underpinning it, really.
That's really fascinating because Pitt's Hanger Manor, which is this place in Ely, it had a connection with John Soames.
Yeah.
And it was John. Yes.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, it becomes even more interesting when we then consider John Soames' role in terms of, because he was part of the Lunar Society. Was he part of the Lunar Society?
I'm
not sure. No, he wasn't. I don't think, yeah. But also the presence in that house of the Hogarth paintings and Hogarth or they weren't the Hogarth paintings themselves, but they were reproductions.
Reproductions, I think. Yeah.
So you have all these multiple histories happening.
Absolutely.
In that space, and it becomes fascinating in terms of that.
And I think that sort of sense of trying to create that kind of parallel world colliding is really important to me in terms of work. Also, I mean, my double consciousness was really formed by working with Inova from the very beginning, and by my peers, you, Keith, and Sonia Boyce, Zarina Bimji, Libena Himid, Martina Tiller, all these people who were my peers and friends, and who taught me a lot in terms of the work that they were making, because it was the conversations about colonialism were completely absent from my art school education, and were of particular interest to me because my mother was born in the Caribbean, my grandfather was born in the Caribbean.
Your mother was born in the Caribbean? Where? Which part?
Born in a tiny island called St. Vincent.
What do you mean tiny island? This is the
St. Vincent is a tiny island.
All of those islands are small. I'm from
Yeah.
Antigua and Montserrat, so those
That's
are also
bigger.
smaller. Yeah, they're all side by side. So I didn't realise this.
Island competitions. But yeah, so
It's against all the Jamaicans who always look on us. No, I'm not going to start some kind of Caribbean.
Don't start that island stuff.
Internal Caribbean thing here, but.
But because of that, I have always been aware of the double consciousness of place, I suppose, and also the difficulties of talking about it. I mean, I don't know what to say about more about that. Really, it's my grandmother got married in the Caribbean, straight off a boat, straight into the church, and. Then had some kind of breakdown, I think, and came back 4 years later. And my mother lived out there till she was 16. So they were divided, and my and then the war broke out. They were meant to come back to this country. The war broke out, so my grandfather and my mother never came back until my mother was 16 to come back to go to school. So, and meeting her mother for the first time after a 12-year separation. So, there's all sorts of reasons why it wasn't really talked about, because it was quite traumatic for everybody involved. And I'm actually quite interested in trying to make some work in collaboration with some other people about that particular history now, because I have all the people involved are dead. So I don't feel like I'm going to be upsetting anybody by raking through the archives. I'm very interested to find more about the facts, and I have sort of fragments of things. Like I have I can find out the records of the ship my mother was on. I've got some pictures of my mother coming over as a 16-year-old to this country on a boat, and I've got various stories about her running into the sea in this country for the first time and nearly dying because of the cold and not realising the difference, and all those kinds of sort of anecdotes. But actually, those are true of hundreds of people. And the whole Windrush scandals that have been happening now, that have been very prominent in the news, have made me want to sort of see what kinds of parallel histories were going on for people in the Windrush generation.
I think to come back to this notion of double consciousness, there's a sense that, there's a feeling sometimes one gets that the idea of a continuous, uninterrupted trajectory is something that we should all long for, a kind of continuous movement of history, a linear progression. I think the experiences of artists like Keith and Jo, and my experience, is one of dislocation and trauma which you can go one of two ways with that. It can be very undermining, or you can see it the way the intellectual Edward Said saw it, which was that he said that he found his bifurcated way of seeing the world actually gave him a doubleness, a doubling of the way of seeing. So it's not a diminution or a deficit, but actually something which doubles and expands the possibilities of seeing things in more than one way. And I guess that's what I see in the works that you both make, that you are resistant to a simplification, a condensation of ideas, but rather always it's about a multi-layering, a complexity, an insistence on lived experience and perception never being unitary or linear.
No, I think that's true.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that relationship to collage and bricolage and to bringing things together is a really strong thing that links what we do.
Yes, absolutely. And I've been here. Obviously, the kind of conversation around double consciousness is here. It's one which I've been subject to and party to for decades. However, I was sitting there thinking, is that something? I mean, I've never felt that as a sort of kind of point of conflict. In a sense, it is about that excitement of different things coming together. And in a sense, just recently, I've been thinking about this kind of really important year and space in terms of the bringing together of particular kinds of sense abilities. And I'm sorry, because I'm in Liverpool now, but I'm talking about Coventry in 1979. And Coventry in 1979 was important. It was the place where I left Birmingham and went to Coventry to do a foundation course, a 1-year foundation course. It's where I met Eddie Chambers, who was also on that foundation course. However, also become more and more aware of what key place Coventry was in 1989, because Coventry was the home of two-tone at that moment. And two-tone was this ultimate collaging, the collaging together of kind of, Jamaican musics,
and punk music.
Historical Jamaican musics, and punk, to make this kind of uniquely British form. And we were there. We went to those bars, we saw the things. That was like the epicenter of that moment. We were only there for like 1 year, but in thinking back, I realized how much that absolutely shaped a lot of our consciousness and a lot of this idea that the collision or the bringing together of these forms, in order to create new ways of articulating aesthetics, is a really exciting thing.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you say that, because I was talking to John Yeadon not so long ago. John Yeadon, a great artist from Coventry, he taught Keith on the foundation, but he also taught Jerry Dammers of the Specials. Yeah. And it's interesting what you said there, Joe, about there not being a sort of colonial or post-colonial discourse within the curriculum of the art schools. And yet that was happening perhaps through charismatic people like John, who understood that he had a politics, basically. I think it was there, but it was not in the actual curriculum, was it, at that time?
I think it was.
You think it was? Okay.
I don't think it was in the curriculum. It was in the conversation.
Yeah, in the conversation.
I remember specifically John Yeadon coming in and giving us all of that what and for, and speaking about his political ideas. Yeah. So it was there.
I think it's really interesting that now that the histories of the 90s are being replayed, that they're being replayed in a segregated way. So we're getting exhibitions that are talking about, the black artist movement and black artists as somehow separate. And, this sensation and YBAs are seen as separate. Yeah. Yet the reality is, many artists black and white artists were together in art schools at the same time, were, cross-generationally, as you're saying, Bryan, in terms of who taught who and who was on what foundation courses or courses with who. But also that actually, work of people like Mark Wallinger, Gillian Waring, it's all about identity. It's all about Britishness. It's all about the construction of identity. It's Lovers Rock, which, could only have happened in England. It couldn't happen anywhere else. It was exactly what Keith was describing. It was a bringing together of a different sound in a different geographical location with a particular moment and consciousness and set of experiences in quite two islands, two-island story fused together. So I think it's really important to recognise that there is something particular about, I think, what happened in the late 80s and 90s, but also about how the very history of art is currently being rewritten and repackaged in particular ways, which are misremembering.
Yeah, I think
do you feel that, Keith? You get invited to be in a lot of these shows.
Do I?
Do you? Well, you do occasionally.
Yes. I kind of completely agree. At the same time, I always think of exhibitions as being like essays. So an essay, you say, okay, what is the title? What is this about? What is it that you are specifically looking at? So it's less of a kind of exclusionary thing. It should be more about, okay, this is what we're looking at now. And then, putting together an article, an essay, a chapter about that. And so in a sense, I always think that makes it valid that you form a subject, and then make that as the show. It's not necessarily an exclusionary thing. It's about I'm looking at this particular thing at this moment now. I'm not sure.
Okay.
And that show that I mentioned in Stoke-on-Trent actually had Mark Wallinger, Lubena, and Zadok Ben David and various people in it. So it was sort of interesting. You're right that the kind of and it was a moment when there was a lot of work. It was sort of, I think, in some ways, the beginning of the idea of the heritage industry, because there was at that point in time more museums and being formed out of abandoned factories. The idea that industrial history. Places closing down and being turned into heritage centres. So all the people worked in the museum were ex-coal miners because of the closures of the pits. So there was all these kinds of shifting of work, the nature of work, into a kind of cultural heritage industry that was being really heavily criticised at the time as well. So
something I think is really I'd like you both to talk about is also that, in a sense, the current political narratives which are dividing us are also being written around race and class. And Jo, your work has often also been about retrieving histories of working class communities, and I'm thinking of the work you did in Southwark, in Bermondsey, which I've written about and which will also be in the book, which I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I live in Bermondsey and I've lived there for about 25 years, which is an area of southeast London that's undergone huge changes, and I'm part of an artist group, Bermondsey Artist Group, which took over an old cafe and they also took over an old church, which was one of the first concrete churches in the country. And it was abandoned. It was on the cusp of the millennium. It was, and I received a commission to do a piece of work in it. And it was very wrecked at the time. It's rather swish now, but I had to really struggle to think about how I was going to use an abandoned church, because I'm an atheist, and I was very aware that, I don't know how to kind of cope with the kind of religious history, but there was also the kind of estate. I live on a 1930s council estate, and most of the estates around me were being demolished at the time. So I had a very strong sense of the history of the area changing and being very rapidly gentrified. And I wanted to bring these things together, and I'd asked Gilane if she would write about the project for the catalogue, and because of the work we'd done together over many years in different contexts, in gallery education and at Innova, and I wanted to try and bring together. There was a lot of very racist attacks happening in the park near the gallery, and I remembered this tape I had as a teenager from the Peace Pledge Union, which was of Martin Luther King's speeches, and I mixed a tiny part of this fragment, which was to do with the church not doing anything in Nazi Germany to stop what was happening in terms of kind of Hitler's rise to power. And so I took this tiny fragment of one of his speeches and I mixed it with some interviews with some people who lived right next to the church, who were kind of Bermondsey, who had worked in the docks and had grown up right next to the park. And I found a tiny piece of film, which at that time, which is now available on YouTube. At that time, it was lurking in a library, and I had to get it. I spent the entire budget for the project getting it transcribed to video from a canister in the British Film Institute. But it was called Some Works of Bermondsey Borough Council. So it was a piece of film which was made at a time when there was a kind of utopic moment in Bermondsey, turning it into a sort of socialist paradise for a very short period of time. This particular, and actually they did amazing things. They had clinics in Switzerland to send children who were suffering from rickets. They had amazing sports centres, and they made a lot of public parks. They had a beautification committee to make Bermondsey more beautiful. And so I used that history in all sorts of different ways in this abandoned church, and mixed the sound of this couple talking about their childhood during the war in this mixture of Martin Luther King, and then I took this tiny clip of the regeneration in a positive sense of trying to a notion of slum clearance to create this new social housing, which I now live in, and just mixed that. So there was a kind of repeated loop of this wall being pushed over and being kind of repeatedly pushed over to create the new future. And I've been thinking about that a lot at the moment because of so many walls being in the news. That I think walls are kind of, the history of walls is one of my next projects.
It's incredibly beautiful work, but also really, really difficult to write about. And that's one of the conundrums about writing about artworks, because artwork is a different language. So when you start writing about it, in a sense, you're already on the back foot, because you almost end up doing what we've been criticising, which is this desire to recreate or reconstitute something in another form, which can never quite be appropriate. So I ended up writing about it in a very elliptical way, in fragments, and not in an art critical sort of way.
Is that why you say art resists language? Is that the
Yeah,
point you're making?
I think that's one of the problems. There's a real fundamental problem about writing about art without closing down what the artist has done, or reducing it, or trying to fix it in some way. Because one of the beauties of work, which is multi-layered and complex and visual, is that you can bring your own narrative to it. It's not shut down. There's an openness. In a sense, you complete it by the way you see it and interpret it and understand it. The minute you start to write about a work of art, you're in a sense fixing something about it. So I think it's a challenge how to find ways to write which can avoid that.
Actually, both of you use research a lot in your work. And there's a question I wanted to ask where, how do you avoid, putting on a show that is basically a PhD in a gallery? Because a lot of artists don't get it right, that the research almost like takes over, and it's simply illustrating some good research. But you both avoid that. At what point do you, in a sense, leave the research to enter this other world where you create something that is, say, beyond language?
Go on.
Well, I think I'm really interested in the fact that any show or any publication is a sort of space. I think of it as a space, and that space always has limitations. So I'm very interested in the fact that where you encounter something or someone always has a huge impact on what that thing is. And so usually for me, what ends up getting made is a result of a relationship to a building or an actual site, and something, the kind of contingency of things, which might be all sorts of things. It might be to do with budget, they might be to do with time, they might be to do with just the experimental process of making something and what happens. Because I remember when the problem for you when I asked you to write the essay was I hadn't got a clue what I was going to do. And I hadn't finished the work because it was an installation, so they wanted the catalogue to be done before the show, and in the end I asked, which has happened several times actually, can we make the catalogue after the show? Because then I have the work. Otherwise it's speculative and I don't have the work. So what are we making the catalogue for? So I think that's another pressure on curators, on artists to say what something's going to be. And if you work the way that we work, on the whole, you don't know what it is until it's kind of landed in the space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been thinking about that as a question. I'm really intrigued by this idea of the exhibition as essay. Anyway, however, exhibition as essay where it's made up of language systems like writing, like image making, like all those language systems which are slippery, which kind of shift and are contingent and can never quite be fixed down. And I'm kind of quite interested in that idea of the slippage. And so when you're speaking about language, about writing about a show, I absolutely understand that the writing becomes difficult because you're trying to pin down this thing, these objects, these images, which are themselves slippery, but you're actually using a form, which is language, which is in itself slippery. And so, that kind of, that absolutely fascinates me. It fascinates me even more, and this is a kind of side story, but it is to do with my encounter with the Relocating the Remains project, the digital project, which I managed to look at for the first time in years, because I'd set up this really old computer in my studio, which was the first time that I had a computer which could actually open the original files. So open the original files, there you go. And the interactivity is written in a particular language system. Then as soon as I move those files to another computer, that language system begins to break down. The computer starts to say, that doesn't make any sense. What does this mean? So you are already aware that there are these things which are fixed at one point, but then become quite fluid in these other spaces. So I've been quite aware of that over the last couple of days, in fact, as I looked at these things again. So I'm interested in that.
And that's also really interesting because some of the work that you were making, when you did A Ship Named Jesus and the show that you had at the Royal College.
Relocating the Remains.
That was Relocating the Remains. Okay, then did see it at the Royal College. Was very advanced in its use of various sort of computer-based imaging. And so it had a big impact on me. And I think the sense of just generationally, we kind of work between analog and digitally because all my work beyond a certain time is in slide form. And in fact, I remember trying to get the image for your book. I had to scan some slides in order to then get the images to give to Gilane. So that's another kind of double consciousness, actually, of the kind of fact that the hegemony of the computer is not the way that history is constituted, and that the kind of archives that the majority of the archives of history are not digital, and so how we account for that and how we work with that is really important because it's overlooked.
Okay, I'm going to open it up to questions in a minute. So as you're preparing your question, I'm going to ask one more here, but be thinking about what you want to ask. Gilane, I was very taken in your introduction, which you sent me, that you said in recent years we've become accustomed to a kind of critical shorthand, which has led us to talk about the margins and the periphery as a position diametrically opposed to the centre. We talk about blackness in antithesis to whiteness. We do this at the same time as we reject the dichotomies and binaries which inform Western culture. In the process, and this is the important bit, we risk falling headlong into what is perhaps the greatest pitfall of all, that of constructing from the politics of difference yet another unassailable fortress which will be absorbed into the canon of Western art and art history. Can you just elaborate a bit on that? And perhaps it's a big claim, but I think it's really interesting that you've, given what you were saying before about that sort of revisionism in looking at the back at the 80s and 90s now.
I guess my observation is that, well, let's go to colonialism. You know, that in the post-colonial struggle, it's very clear what you're contesting, and that you're looking to open up something new and different, which will supersede and be very different from what currently exists. But if you look at all the places where those nationalist struggles succeeded, very many of them failed to change the structural conditions or continue that constant challenge and critique. And I think that's, and the art world, the art market is is amoeba-like. It has a natural, easy ability to absorb all kinds of contestation and difference. So what was really radical, 30 years ago, is very soon an exhibit in a museum. And I'll give you an example. Stuart Brisley, who I've been interviewing recently, brilliant performance artist, actually set a fire at Tate and was ejected. It was a performance piece he did, and was ejected, and police were called and so on. The Tate has now refers to this as the first performance work which Tate hosted. So that's a very, I think, very clear example of how, that radicalness and that innovation can become absorbed, and that we need to be vigilant.
Absolutely. Right. Okay. Can we have just a little bit of light on the audience? That's better. Thank you. So I'm looking at a forest of hands, or trying to imagine a forest of hands. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, there's one. Microphone. There's one up here. Thank you. Oh, we're going to do this one first, and we'll come back to Alan in a minute. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
I'm interested in the concept of built-in obsolescence. Now, although that refers to generally various forms of technology, but I wonder how, looking at the whole point of obsolescence within history and the gaps and the things we fill in and we don't fill in, and the things that are made impossible to go back to or to know about. And I was thinking, I don't know if you've heard of Edward Rushton, but he, in fact, was one of the first people in this country who started anti-slave protests and meetings. And a lot of that is very directly related to power. Who has power and influence? And he was a sailor, Liverpool-based sailor, who worked on the slave ships, and he was absolutely appalled by the condition in which slaves were being transported and so on. And he attempted to try and help them by giving them water and things like this. But in the process, he also picked up a disease where he became blind. And so a lot of his energy also went into developing, I think, this country's first blind school and organisation. But a lot of his original work had been around anti-slave campaigns, but you don't hear him mentioned. So the sort of gaps and who has power to reflect and to say what, whether it's in art or history or even in universities. That for me is, and I just wondered what you might think about that kind of concept and how some things are new and therefore you throw away the old. And then sometimes it's very difficult to go back to the old because it's been blocked off or something else has been put in its place that replaces the discourse around that issue.
Yeah, it has to be said that Rushton is now being revisited, and there's been, as you know, last year or the year before, there was a play about Rushton in Liverpool, which Dardafest did. So I think you're right, but maybe with technology, one of the good things about it is on the internet you can actually do this research quickly. So I think he is being recognised now as probably more important than Roscoe.
I'm also fascinated by your ability to tell that story, or the act of telling that story now, because that is also an act of power, in a sense, and it was also about how we encounter that story in 2019 and what that story then begins to mean to us in this moment. So embodied in all of that is about those kind of things about power and slippage and the narrative.
Okay, I think we had a question up here. Thank you.
Yeah, is this
Yep.
it? Yeah. My question's a two-parter. So, firstly, thanks a lot for a really interesting discussion, and I'm particularly interested in the fact that Trophies of Empire didn't happen anywhere near London, and I was wondering about regionalism, especially in the light of Keith's really interesting kind of anecdote about two-tone and Coventry, and the links between working class white lives and working class black lives, and the way they make meaning in ways there which actually became national eventually, but they were very local before they became national. So my question really is the importance of moving beyond London and the way that happened actually in the 90s in really quite exciting ways. You only have to look at the importance of Rochdale and Labaina Hamid's Revenge exhibition there in 92. And the second question really is another part. They're all everyone's questions are partial, aren't they? My second question is about modern black artists who are of the next generation. And we were lucky enough to have Stuart Hall Foundation student Jade Montserrat in the Bluecoat last year, or was it earlier this year? Earlier this year, and just the legacy and what you think of the kinds of ways in which new artists are taking on board the kinds of generational legacies to create new work, which actually kind of is dealing with the same history, but in kind of radically new ways.
Yeah, just to come back on the point about regionalism. I mean, Keith and I took part in a study at the Arnold Feeney in Bristol about Trophies of Empire, and we talked about this, didn't we? The fact that there was this network that you've described, and it was in the Midlands and it was in the North, but it was also Bristol. You know, but it was not London. And maybe Gilane can comment on that in a minute. But it was very hard for us to get those sorts of exhibitions into London, and obviously a lot of the artists were based there, but they found their expression was in a lot of municipal galleries. I think we underestimate the importance of galleries like Rochdale, Huddersfield, Sheffield. These were really important regional galleries, and certainly in your career, I mean, the first show you had was at Wolverhampton Art Gallery, wasn't it, Keith?
Yes, it's fascinating the way that these particular spaces shift also. And I was really struck by what you said about Coventry, because obviously Coventry in 1979, 1980 was this really exciting place in terms of this whole crossing over of musics, of kind of art from scenes. A couple of years later, I don't know quite when, I'd already left, and I think I was in Nottingham at the time. But commentary suddenly became this very dangerous place. It became a kind of risky city full of kind of fascist attacks. Now, I'm not clear why that happened or why it transitioned in that way from that moment at the start of the 80s to this moment in the mid-80s when it became a kind of hotbed of fascist activity. And those kind of shifts become really interesting in thinking about it. And those shifts, we can also see those shifts in the art world where very specific galleries, because of, cultural policy, etc., become these hotbeds, like Rochdale and all that kind of stuff. And then, it changes. And so we kind of read those differences. I think those are the histories which can be really excavated in a quite an interesting way.
Yeah. Perhaps you could answer that point about the London not... It shows like the Whitechapel from Two Worlds happened, but that was almost like after the event.
Yeah. No, I think...
Perhaps you could say why you think that...
I think the reality is that spaces like Bluecoat, Wolverhampton, Rochdale have actually been far more radical and experimental than many London galleries. And, the Vale, Innova, it was a real struggle to find London galleries that were willing to work on shows which they found particularly challenging, or artists, quite frankly, that they'd never heard of, who hadn't yet been validated. So I think there's an openness and an appetite for risk-taking and experiment, which is really precious and important, and without which I think many things would not have then come back into the capital. Yeah. Just to pick up the point, Alan, about the intergeneration between artists, I think that is critical. It's really, there's something, of course, Oedipal about it, which is the fact that, different generations of artists will be inspired and, in some ways, but also be wanting to overturn and do something very different. But that's always been the case, Frank Bowling and Sonia Boyce had heated arguments, and really healthy disagreements about what black art is and should be, and that must continue. Just even much smaller gaps in generation. Chris Ofili and Steve McQueen had a very different approach to how they wanted to present their work, how they wanted to they wanted it contextualized, and so on. And I think that's Tracy Emin refused to be in a show because I think she thought that was going to frame her work in a certain way. And yet now Tracy's kind of, much more confident about talking about questions around race and difference and how that has informed her practice. So, yeah, I think there's a number of things that converge here around generations, around a natural intergenerational desire to move away, but also about the conditions of the art world, how artists are educated and the context in which they are taught and emerge as artists, which influence how they present and the nature of their work.
Jo, I was going to say, would you like to say something in terms of being a teacher at the Royal College?
Oh, yeah. I think it's a really interesting time at the moment because there was I think in the kind of 80s and that whole sort of thing about YBA-ness and all of those kind of issues about a certain kind of work that was being marketed, very heavily marketed. It was being exported by the British Council as British art, and there was clearly a kind of parallel, more politicised version of work, which was more or less invisible in different ways at that time. Or there was a debate. Anyway, there was a kind of debate about whether work should even contain politics. When I was on my MA at Chelsea, I was told by a tutor who will remain nameless, actually, that my work looked like propaganda. And it was clearly a very bad thing for it to look like. And so that sort of sense that art shouldn't be political, there was a sort of market, because the market was rising. There was a huge market emerging for contemporary art, and people didn't want it to be political. So I think there was a kind of parallel. There was a sort of hiding and suppressing of certain sorts of work at that time, actually, or a recovering of it. I mean, not in a recovery way, but in a covering way. And so I think those tensions in art schools were very marked in the late, or maybe the early, about 10 years ago at the RCA, when everyone was talking about how much they could sell their work for. You know, and the pressure on students at the final show was, Saatchi was coming around every show. He'd come in early. He'd try and buy people's entire shows. And he'd often try and buy the shows that from different colleges that were quite similar, and then kind of bury one person's work. And so we were saying, don't sell your entire show to Saatchi, because there is a chance it will go into a cupboard and will never be seen again, which did happen to a couple of people. But so there was that sort of market-led thing. Now there's, I think, a healthier skepticism about the market and an interest in politics. We've got students very actively engaged in kind of questioning kind of the nature of history. You know, the debates about decolonising the curriculum have been very, very vociferous over the last couple of years at the RCA, and have had some really interesting and positive results in terms of what's now taught, actually, and what some of the debates that are happening. So I think we're in a really interesting time, because in a way the market model's there, the kind of histories of earlier kind of political work is there too, and so in a way students have to navigate somewhere between all those kind of possibilities.
Can I just quickly say that, because I teach at a Middlesex which markets itself as a black university. It is extremely diverse. Maybe most diverse in London after East London or something. However, the kind of art and design departments are less so. However, there have been waves and waves of very interesting young artists of colour, young black artists, artists from a whole range of places. And so you have seen waves of political engagement, as you say, questions around decolonialising the curriculum, etc., have been key. The biggest struggle which I've had with these particular students is their awareness of what has already happened. Just trying to get them not to reinvent the wheel, but to have enough of a conscious of what has happened in order to build on that, or reject it, or whatever, but to be aware that these things, that these histories have taken place, and to take it from there.
Okay, question here.
I just want to respond as the young'un in the audience. But an interesting thing in relation to what you were all saying about regional dynamics, but also and the intergenerational, especially when I kind of discovered Inova's work, I was discovering two things: the regional. So I'm from Birmingham, discovering people like you, people like Dan or Ronnie, artists don't come from Smethwick. So when I found that out, I was like, what? But also those who work in the global diaspora. So trying to connect those two things as well, I think, is something really important for the younger generation and what we're trying to do. And what I think is quite interesting is that if you analyze it, there's always been that exchange, especially when it comes to the aesthetics of things. So an artist I think about a lot is Nima Hammond, who was recently nominated for the Turner Prize. And his work, he does a lot of work investigating the era in which he was born. So he's a Bangladeshi artist, and he does a lot of work around analysing the project of the left in the 70s, not just about the project of the left in Bangladesh, but the entire global context, and especially the film 2 Meetings and a Funeral blew my mind because also you just see all these leaders, they're so charismatic, and you forget that they sort of, a lot of them led to their own demise. But also the aesthetics of that work reminds me a lot of like Black Audio Film Collective, the Artilith Group. So there's this kind of constellation that I'm putting together in my head right now, which is getting me really excited about art history, but also when thinking about, you know, the next generation. This is the material that we're working with. It's a very rich tapestry, and we also have access. Not, to be fair, not all of us, but a lot of us have access and the ability to reach out to these people in the diaspora as well. So I think the conversation can get a lot richer than we think it is. I'm just really excited.
Thank you for that. Any
I
further questions?
I think that's a really good point about so much of moving image work and stuff that is available and can be shared, and that the kind of positive sides of technology that allows people to share across geographies and stuff as well. I think it is really exciting.
Okay. Is that it? Any further questions? Can we go? Perhaps, Gilane, perhaps some closing remarks in terms of this book. It's very exciting. It's going to come out next year, and perhaps some reflections on it, given that it will add to the discourse. It will be 30 years of 20 years, 20 years, 30 years. 25 years of writing, and given what we've just heard about,
I was a very young starter.
We need more of that access to those really important key documents. And I have to say, some of the things you're writing are absolutely key. Like, I think the trophies thing is still, for me, it's one I return to a lot. So perhaps some reflections.
Well, I guess in a way that perhaps Keith was saying, it's a bit like you don't really know what your obsessions and preoccupations are until you're forced to go back into your own archive and start to create a narrative from what you've written. And lots of what I wrote was in response to invitations from artists or directors of institutions and curators. So I thought I was just responding to lots of different things that had not very much connection. And it's only when I had to go through it all and try and find the connections that I realised there were some ongoing obsessions and preoccupations. One of them, which you touched on, was about, artistic practice and how you find a way to talk about artistic practice on its own terms and privilege artistic practice as a way of seeing, researching, understanding and knowing the world. It's not something, an add-on. It doesn't follow from anything else. It is a discrete area of research and practice and knowledge making. And the second thing was that interconnectedness, the fact that, so many of these histories are overlapping, these practices are interconnected. And actually, there are lots of other potential projects to be done about the history of art schools and who was there, who studied with who was taught by who was influenced by who. So there are different kinds of way of clustering knowledge. And then the third thing is this point that you brought out about the double consciousness, about and I hope that I'm really pleased to hear that Innova is a source of inspiration and resource, because that I think that a lot of artists sometimes found themselves feeling quite isolated and alone, not knowing, struggling to know whether what they were writing or what they were making or what the way they were seeing the world, whether that had any it wasn't being validated, it wasn't being reinforced by the context of the art school or by the art world. So it's very lonely. Yeah. So I think it's really, really important, the point that you're both making about making those connections across generations and writing our own histories, actually, of artistic practice and influence.
Yeah, thank you.
Jo? That's really lovely thing about having conversations as well. I just did a seminar with our students and realised that this Innova book, Difference and Modernity, which there's an extract of it, which is a conversation between Stuart Hall and Sarat Maharaj, both people I have huge respect for and who've taught me a lot. And so I share that with the students, and partly because it's a conversation as well, and they're not agreeing about everything, that it's also about that permission to disagree and to take a history and to challenge it and to change it and to think about it in relation to current circumstances. And I think that's a really valuable thing to give people permission to do in an educational situation, and also to know that there are all these resources and that some of these conversations have happened before in different contexts and in different sort of configurations. And so I sort of think conversation is a really important thing, because there is so much a sense of isolation and anxiety around in all sorts of ways, actually. I mean, that's one of the conditions that I see amongst my students most is anxiety. And so anything that can stop that and make that anxiety shared or build on shared concerns is really important.
Absolutely, I agree, and that's why one of the key things in terms of all artists, young artists in particular, is the thing of those collective moments, even if it's coming together collectively for a conversation or collective gatherings or whatever. And also, on top of that, the importance of those gatherings being recorded in some way, and then the importance of that archive. I mean, it's a great shame that the conversation that we had in Bristol wasn't recorded.
I know.
It was some of the most important. And in a sense, I mean, one of the really interesting ones is that there was an event which happened in 1981, which was the first National Black Art Convention in Wolverhampton, which has gone into history. The history of those conversations has been retold and retold many times. It's only recently that the cassettes of those conversations have actually been digitized and placed online. And it's kind of quite interesting to then compare the historical accounts, the historical retellings of those conversations with the tapes, because they're not quite the same. People say, hold on, I thought you said that. And it was, so that's really interesting. A couple of years later, we had a second conference, which was Radical Black Art and Working Convention. There is no record of that. There were no tapes. No one recorded anything. Nobody took any photographs. That's why I take photographs all the time. Nobody took any photographs. It's almost as though that event did not exist. And I think that is a great shame, because it becomes so important that we hold these archival things, and so therefore people can then look back and get a sense of, the historical disputes. The fact that it was never this kind of smooth, as we told it, event. People were fighting, people were arguing, all of that kind of stuff was happening.
Great. Well, thank you. We have to close now. Is that okay? Sorry. One final comment.
It was just, how do you see traditional cultural art within the context of art? In many ways, we're talking about a Western concept of art. And I wonder, so for instance, Aboriginal art, which is about their culture and storytelling, traditional tattooing in identifying your status within your community in the Pacific. So I just wonder, when we're talking about art, the concept of art, and how does traditional forms of art, the cultural traditional forms of art, from other cultures actually fit in with the concept of art that we're talking about today?
I don't know if I should, but isn't artinism itself built out of an encounter with a whole range of other art forms? I mean, Picasso went out and looked at African sculptors. Obviously, he absorbed those from the point of view of a Western male, but in terms of particular approaches to the visual, those things were taken from a range of other places. And so I see all of those creative approaches as kind of part of what we think about now, part of what we can use, part of what we can learn from. in this moment. If that makes sense.
Okay, we'll have to draw a closer, I think. I'm going to thank everybody. Our panellists, and we'll give them a round of applause in a minute. But before I get to that, I'd like to thank the Arts Council for their support for this event. Yeah, Arts Council, yeah, absolutely. Jajit Chauhan from the university, thank you very much for collaborating with us on this. I think it's been a great occasion with as part of your Luminary lecture series. And Russell, was Russell here? For helping us set the whole thing up, and for our technical team here, and Rachel, of course, who's live streaming as we speak. So what Keith was saying there before about things disappearing into the annals of history or disappearing, this will be recorded for perpetuity.
Stream, but is it?
Yeah, it's going to be recorded. It's recorded, and you'll be able to go on.
We're going to erase the recording.
It will go online with our website, probably John Moore's and probably others. So thank you very much. So when you leave, Louis is going to give you some bits of paper just to fill out your email addresses if you'd like to, and would appreciate any feedback you can give us. It's a very simple online form you can do when you get home. So would you put your hands together for a great evening?